When a grieving young master says, "Take off her chains," a war of papers, hymns, and oaths begins. Iron cuffs drop to the dirt as field hands watch in stunned silence. The girl lifts her head, tears streaming, but the overseer's face twists with rage. In the dusty attic, they find a family Bible with faded ink in the margins, words that could mean freedom or forge a trap. Dogs bay in the distance. Federal agents with fake badges ride hard toward the plantation, but this child remembers everything, every seal, every lie, every hidden truth that powerful men buried in blue wax and shadow. The courthouse bell tolls as storm clouds gather. A judge raises his gavel while the crowd holds its breath. When the girl opens her mouth to recite what she's never forgotten, will her perfect memory be enough to break the chains forever, or will the truth she speaks seal her fate and destroy them all? The kitchen held dawn like a cupped palm. Mary stirred the corn mush with a wooden spoon worn smooth by decades of hands, her own small fingers wrapped around it like roots finding purchase. Steam rose from the pot, carrying the scent of ash and grain, while outside the window, Mississippi morning crept across the cotton fields in ribbons of gray and gold. She hummed as she stirred. The melody wound through the kitchen like creek water over stones, low notes that seemed to map valleys, high ones that traced ridgelines. The tune had verses that spoke of ferries and landings, of cypress knees rising from black water, of signals and safe passages. But Mary sang only the melody, letting it pour from her throat like honey from a broken comb. The new master stood in the doorway, hat in his hands. Elias Ward had arrived 3 days before with papers crumpled from travel and eyes that carried the weight of funeral dirt. 26 years old, thin as a fence post, shoulders bent under debts that had followed him from Virginia like hungry dogs. His mother's death had left him this inheritance: a failing plantation, field hands who watched him with careful eyes, and an overseer who smiled with too many teeth. "She's got the voice of an angel and the memory of a courthouse clerk," the cook had warned him that first night, ladling stew into his tin cup. But Harlan keeps her chained for good reason. Child sees too much, remembers too much, makes folks nervous. Now Elias watched those chains catch the hearthlight iron cuffs around ankles, thin as kindling, connected by links that chinked against the kitchen floorboards with each step. The sound made his stomach turn. "Why does she wear those indoors?" he asked. Harlan Pike emerged from the shadows like smoke given substance, tall and barrel-chested, with hands stained permanent brown from tobacco juice and eyes the color of dirty water. "Because she's defiant, Mr. Ward. Too clever by half. Give her an inch of freedom and she'll take a mile of trouble." Mary's humming stopped. She turned from the pot, and Elias saw her face for the first time in full light, sharp cheekbones, skin the color of creek tea, eyes that held depths he couldn't fathom. Maybe 9 years old, maybe 10. Old enough to carry wisdom, young enough for it to break your heart. "The old mistress," Mary said, her voice clear as spring water, said on her deathbed. "The ribbon in the Bible knows the way home." Said it 3 times while the fever burned. Word for word, just like that. Harlan's face darkened. "See what I mean? Child parrots everything, twists it around to sound important." Old woman was out of her head with sickness. But Elias stepped closer, studying Mary's face. There was no deception there, no calculation. Just memory, pure and deep as a well. What ribbon? Blue as September sky. She kept it in her Bible, marking pages about promises and covenants. I remember because she let me dust the sitting room once, and when I knocked the book off the table, she didn't whip me. Just picked it up gentle and smoothed the ribbon back into place. The kitchen door creaked open. Field hands shuffled in for their morning corn mush, 3 men weathered by sun and labor, 1 woman with graying hair tucked under a faded head wrap. They moved quiet as deer, eyes flicking between the new master and the overseer, sensing the tension that hung in the air like smoke before thunder. Elias felt their attention settle on him, felt the weight of first impressions. Whatever he did next would echo through every corner of the plantation. Would he be another in the long line of masters who saw slaves as property and nothing more? Or would he be something different? His mother's voice whispered in his memory, reading from Scripture by lamplight. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the broken-hearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised. The iron at Mary's ankles clinked as she ladled mush into tin bowls. Each sound was a small violence, a reminder of power and powerlessness. Elias watched the girl move with careful grace, never letting the chains tangle, never letting them trip her. She had learned to dance around her bondage, but the dance itself was a wound. "Mr. Pike," Elias said, his voice carrying farther than intended. The field hands looked up from their bowls. The cook paused her chopping. Even the morning birds outside seemed to quiet. "Take off her chains." Silence fell like a curtain. Harlan's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "Mr. Ward, sir, with respect." Now. The overseer's hand moved to the keys at his belt, but his eyes promised trouble. "You're making a mistake. Child's been docile because she knows her place. Remove the iron, and you'll have rebellion on your hands. Then, I'll handle rebellion when it comes." Elias stepped into the yard, raising his voice so it carried to the quarters, to the fields, to every ear within reach. "A master never marries a slave, they told me back in Virginia. Said it was unnatural, ungodly, against the order of things. Well, maybe they're right about marriage, but my first order stands. Take off her chains." Murmurs rippled through the gathered hands. The cook set down her knife with a sharp click. Harlan's face flushed red as fresh brick. "You're starting something you can't finish," the overseer warned. "Then help me finish it right." Elias held out his hand for the key. "Or find work elsewhere." The standoff stretched like a bowstring. Field hands watched from the corners of their eyes, not daring to stare directly but missing nothing. The sun climbed higher, painting the packed dirt of the yard in shades of gold and amber. A rooster crowed from the chicken coop, oblivious to the human drama unfolding. Finally, Harlan spat in the dust and pulled the key ring from his belt. He stalked to Mary, who stood frozen by the kitchen door like a deer caught between water and wolves. The overseer knelt and worked the locks with angry, efficient movements. The first cuff fell open, then the second. The chains dropped to the packed earth with a sound like coins scattered on a coffin lid. Mary stared down at her ankles, at the clean bands of paler skin where the iron had rested. She lifted one foot, then the other, as if testing whether the freedom was real. When she looked up at Elias, tears tracked down her cheeks like rain on glass. "Thank you," she whispered. The field hands had gone still as church mice, but their silence hummed with unspoken thoughts. The cook crossed herself and muttered something under her breath. Harlan coiled the chains over his arm like a snake he might need to use again. "Don't make me regret this kindness," the overseer said, his voice low and mean. "Child causes trouble. It's on your head." "Show me that Bible with the ribbon," Elias said to Mary, ignoring Harlan's threat. The girl nodded, her bare feet silent on the floorboards as she led him toward the house. Behind them, the fallen chains caught the morning light like a promise kept, like a first step on a longer road that none of them could see the end of. The plantation house rose before them, its columns stained with rain and its paint peeling like old skin. But for the first time since arriving, Elias didn't see only decay and debt. He saw possibility. A place where chains could fall and voices could rise. A place where even the smallest acts of mercy might grow into something larger than fear. The attic crawl space smelled of dust and old sorrows. Mary moved through it like she belonged there, stepping over rotted floorboards and ducking beneath cobwebbed beams. Elias followed, hat in hand, trying not to sneeze at the particles floating in the thin shafts of light that squeezed between loose shingles. "Here," Mary said, kneeling beside a cedar trunk bound with leather straps. "The old mistress kept her private things up here, Bibles at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth." She lifted out layers of carefully folded fabric silk gowns gone yellow with age, lace collars stiff as dried flowers, a wedding dress that crumbled at her touch. Beneath it all lay a package wrapped in waxed cloth, tied with string gone brittle as old bones. Mary unwrapped it with the reverence of a priest handling sacrament. The Bible was small and thick, bound in dark leather with brass corners green from years of damp air. A ribbon marked its place, not blue as September sky as Mary had remembered, but faded to the color of winter twilight. Still, it was ribbon, and it was there. "She used to read from this every evening," Mary said, her fingers tracing the worn cover. "Sometimes she'd let me sit by her chair and listen. said the good book was full of promises that folks forgot to keep. Elias took the Bible from her hands. It fell open naturally at the ribbon's place, somewhere in the middle of Psalms, but his eye caught something else, faint ink in the margins, words written in a hand so light they barely disturbed the page. He tilted the book toward the nearest shaft of light. Upon the marriage of any ward heir to a woman of any station, or upon the swearing of a solemn oath before witnesses, the bonded servant, known as Marries, shall be granted full manumission, with all rights and privileges thereunto, this clause to be sealed and witnessed by proper authority. The ink was pale as old tea, the letters spidery with age. But the words were clear enough to set Elias's heart hammering like a trapped bird. "Can you read?" he asked Marries. "Some. The old mistress taught me scripture." He showed her the margin note. She studied it with the intensity of a scholar, her lips moving silently as she worked through the unfamiliar legal language. "Manumission," she said finally. "That means freedom." "It does." Elias's voice came out rougher than intended. "But there's a problem. See this line here about sealing and witnessing? The clause isn't complete without the county clerk's official seal and signature. Without that, it's just ink on paper." Footsteps on the ladder below made them both freeze. Harlan's voice drifted up through the floorboards, talking to someone in the hallway. "Keeping them up there long enough to dig up whatever foolishness she's got. Hidden. Judge won't take kindly to sentiment over law. Probate deadline coming fast. And Mr. Ward's got debts enough to sink a steamboat." The voices faded as the speakers moved away, but their words hung in the dusty air like poison. Elias looked at Marries, saw his own worry reflected in her dark eyes. "What's probate?" she asked. "Court proceeding to settle an estate. My mother's will? Her debts? What happens to this place? The judge has to approve everything, including—" he gestured around the crumbling attic. "Including who stays and who goes." Marries nodded slowly, understanding more than her years should have allowed. "And if the judge don't approve this freedom clause, then it dies with the ink that wrote it." They sat in silence for a moment, dust motes spinning around them like tiny spirits. The Bible felt heavy in Elias's hands, weighted with possibility and peril. Below them, the plantation house creaked and settled, full of watching eyes and listening ears. "We need proof," Marries said finally. "Not just ink, the clerk's seal, like it says." "The county clerk is away on circuit," Elias replied. "Won't be back for days, maybe weeks. And even then, proving this clause is authentic." He shook his head. "Harlan's right about one thing. The judge doesn't care much for sentiment." Marries reached out and touched the faded ribbon with one finger. "The old mistress said this ribbon knew the way home. Maybe she meant it different than I thought." "How so?" "Maybe it don't just mark a place in the book. Maybe it marks a path to somewhere else. Somewhere the real proof is hiding." It was a child's hope, but something in her certainty made Elias want to believe. He closed the Bible carefully, keeping the ribbon in place, and tucked it under his coat. "First thing," he said, "we find out what the clerk's seal looks like. Can't prove authenticity without knowing what authentic looks like." Marries smiled, for the first time since he'd known her, expression that transformed her thin face into something luminous. The old mistress had a saying, "God helps them that help themselves, but he also sends along folks who know where things are kept." Meaning? Meaning there's folks in town who've seen that seal plenty of times. We just got to ask the right questions. They climbed down from the attic with dust in their hair and hope in their hearts, neither one fully understanding the storm they were about to walk into. Behind them, the ribbon caught the last shaft of light like a thread of destiny, marking their place in a story that was only beginning to unfold. The probate office squatted on Main Street like a toad in Sunday clothes, all official dignity on the outside, but damp and dim within. Elias pushed open the door, causing a small bell to jangle overhead. Marries followed close behind, her bare feet silent on the warped floorboards. "Clerk's still away," said a voice from behind a wall of ledger books. A young man emerged, ink-stained and pale as old parchment. "Won't be back till next week at earliest. Court business takes him all over the county." Elias had expected this, but disappointment still settled in his chest like a stone. "I'm Elias Ward, settling my mother's estate. I was hoping to verify some documents." The apprentice's eyes sharpened with interest. "Ward place out on Cypress Creek? Heard you been making changes." stirring things up some. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially word about masters who freed their slaves' chains in full view of field hands and overseers. Elias could feel the weight of reputation building around him like storm clouds. "Nothing that can't wait for proper legal review," he said carefully. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Miri had drifted toward the far wall, where a board displayed various wax impressions, samples of seals and stamps used by different officials. She stood before it like a visitor in a gallery, studying each mark with the intensity she brought to everything. A chair creaked in the corner. Elias turned to see a man in dusty clothes and worn boots, the kind who made his living on horseback and carried authority in the set of his shoulders. A patroller, most likely, waiting for some bit of business with the court. "You'd be the ward boy," the patroller said. It wasn't a question. "Elias Ward, yes. Heard you got interesting ideas about property management." The man's voice carried no particular threat, but no warmth either. "Hope you ain't planning to cause difficulties. County's got enough troubles without folks getting ideas above their station." Before Elias could respond, Miri's voice cut through the tension like a knife through warm butter. "That one there's got a nick on the left side, and the swirl in the middle don't close proper." The apprentice looked up from his ledger. "What's that now?" Miri pointed to one of the wax impressions on the board. "The county clerk's seal. It's got a little nick where someone dropped it on stone, and the decorative swirl in the center, see how it don't quite meet itself? Makes it look like a snail shell with its mouth open." The patroller stood up, his boots loud on the floor. "Child's got sharp eyes. Too sharp for her own good," muttered the apprentice, but he walked over to look at the seal impression Miri had identified. "She's right about the nick. Happened 2 years ago when the clerk's bag fell off his horse crossing Willow Creek." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp office air. If Miri could identify the authentic seal's characteristics so precisely, she could just as easily spot a forgery. And if someone wanted to entrap them with false documents, mighty observant, for one so young, the patroller said, his eyes moving from Miri to Elias. "Hope that observation serves her well. County can be dangerous for folks who see too much." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Elias put his hand on Miri's shoulder, feeling her tense under his touch. "We'll be careful," he said. "See that you are." The patroller touched his hat brim and headed for the door. County's got ways of protecting itself from complications. After he left, silence settled over the office like dust after a windstorm. The apprentice returned to his ledgers, but kept glancing up at them with nervous eyes. Miri stared at the wall of seal impressions as if memorizing every mark and flourish. "That blue wax there," she said quietly, pointing to another impression. "That's the right color for the clerk's seal?" "Yes," the apprentice replied. "He favors blue wax from Richmond, orders it special." Miri nodded, filing away another piece of crucial information. But Elias could see worry creeping into her expression. If they could identify authentic seals and wax, others could create convincing forgeries. And a forged document in the wrong hands could destroy any hope of freedom worse. It could be used as evidence of fraud, punishable by much worse than chains. "We should go," he said softly. Outside, the afternoon sun felt warm after the chill of the probate office, but the sense of being watched remained. Eyes followed them from windows and doorways. Conversations paused as they passed. The news of the freed chains had spread through town like ripples in a pond, and not everyone approved of the disturbance. "They're planning something," Miri said, as they walked toward the livery stable where they'd left their horse and cart. "What makes you think so?" "The way that patroller looked at the seal board after I named its marks. Like he was storing up information for later use, and the apprentice got nervous when I showed I could tell true from false." Elias considered this. The child's instincts had proven reliable so far. If they plant forged papers, then we better be ready with real ones first. Miri looked up at him, her dark eyes serious beyond her years. "Question is, where would the clerk keep the true documents, the ones that match what's written in that Bible margin?" It was a question that would haunt them through the evening and into the restless night ahead, as storm clouds gathered overhead and the first drops of rain began to fall like tears from a weeping sky. In the distance, dogs howled, whether from loneliness or something else entirely, neither could say. The storm arrived at midnight, with the fury of divine judgment. Rain lashed the plantation house windows, while thunder shook the rafters and lightning split the darkness into jagged fragments of day. Elias lay awake in his mother's old bedroom, listening to water drip through loose shingles into buckets placed strategically around the attic. He'd given Mary a proper room, the old seamstress's quarters off the main hall, with a real bed instead of quarters floor and a window that looked out toward the river. It had caused more muttering among the hands, more dark looks from Harlan, but Elias found he cared less about disapproval with each passing hour. The girl deserved better than she'd received, and if that made him a radical in the eyes of his neighbors, so be it. A soft knock at his door made him sit up. "Come." Mary slipped inside, her nightgown white as mist in the lamplight. "Can't sleep. Keep thinking about seals and wax, and who might be making what." "Me too." He gestured to the chair by the window. "The storm's got everyone restless." She settled into the chair like a cat, finding the perfect spot, tucking her bare feet beneath her. Outside, another flash of lightning illuminated the rain-swept yard, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. "The old mistress used to say storms were God's way of washing the world clean," Mary said, getting ready for something new to grow. Wise woman, sounds like. She was. Sad, too. Lost 3 babies before they could walk, and her husband died young. This plantation was all she had left of her family, and it was eating itself alive even then. Think that's why she wrote that clause in the Bible margin. Wanted something good to come from all the sorrow. Elias studied the girl's profile in the lamplight, struck again by the depth of understanding in someone so young. "Tell me about your family." Mary was quiet for so long, he thought she might not answer. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Don't remember much about my mama. She died when I was small, fever took her quick. My daddy." She paused, swallowing hard. "He tried to run when I was 6. They brought him back torn up by dogs and whipped him till he couldn't stand. He died 3 days later, and I've been wearing chains ever since." Harlan said it was to remind me what happened to runaways, children. The cruelty of it struck Elias like a physical blow. A child punished for her father's desperate bid for freedom, chained not for her own crimes but as a warning to others. It was a system designed to break spirits as much as bodies. "I'm sorry," he said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. "Ain't your fault. You weren't even here then." She looked at him with those dark, serious eyes. "But you're here now, and you took off my chains. That means something." Another flash of lightning, followed by thunder so close it rattled the windows. The storm was directly overhead now, turning the night into a battleground between heaven and earth. "Mary," Elias said carefully, "if that clause in the Bible is real, if we can make it legal, what would you want? Where would you go?" She considered this, her head tilted slightly to one side. "Ain't thought much about going anywhere. This is the only place I ever known. But," she paused, choosing her words like stones for a foundation, "I'd want to learn more reading, maybe help other folks who got chains that need taking off, and I'd want to sing hymns that don't have to carry secret messages. Just sing them plain and beautiful, like they was meant to be." The simplicity of her dreams, education, service, the freedom to worship without code or concealment, made Elias's throat tight with emotion. These were not the ambitions of someone seeking to destroy a way of life, but of someone hoping to improve it. "If we can make this work," he said, "you'll have all of that. Education, purpose, safety. My word on it." Mary smiled, and for a moment the storm seemed to quiet, as if the very air was holding its breath. "Your word and God's providence. That's a powerful combination." A new sound cut through the yes, thunder dogs baying in the distance, their voices carried on the wind like ghostly warnings. Mary's smile faded, and she moved to the window to peer out into the storm-lashed darkness. "Patrollers," she said, "but they ain't hunting tonight. Too much water, too much wind. This is something else." "What kind of something else?" "The kind where folks use bad weather as cover for worse business." She turned from the window, her expression grim. "Mr. Ward, I think we need to move faster than we planned. Storm or no storm, there's trouble brewing, and it's got our names on it." Outside, lightning split the sky again, illuminating a landscape transformed by wind and rain. But in that brief moment of harsh light, Elias could have sworn he saw figures moving through the storm shadows with purpose, heading toward the plantation like harbingers of judgment. The battle for Marries' freedom, he realized, was about to begin in earnest. Dawn broke grey and grudging over a world transformed by storm. Elias stood on the plantation house porch, watching water drip from every surface like tears from a morning sky. The yard had turned to mud soup, and fallen branches littered the ground like broken bones. But it was the quiet that unsettled him most. No bird song, no usual bustle of morning chores, just the sound of water seeking its level. "Fields are flooded past the second furrow," Harlan reported, his boots squelching as he climbed the porch steps. "Lost half the corn crop, maybe more. And there's other troubles brewing." "What kind of troubles?" The overseer's smile was sharp as a skinning knife. "Seems words got out about your charitable inclinations. Some folks in town are asking questions about the Ward estate, about whether a man with such modern ideas is fit to inherit property that includes human property." Elias felt ice in his veins, despite the humid morning air. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that get judges thinking about federal oversight. The kind that make county officials wonder if maybe this whole estate should be administered by someone more traditional in their thinking." Before Elias could respond, Mary appeared around the corner of the house, her dress muddy to the knees but her eyes bright with purpose. In her hands she carried a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Found something in the storm cellar," she announced. "Water got into everything, but this was wrapped up tight in the old root barrel." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal a collection of papers, letters, receipts, what looked like medical prescriptions. The ink had run on some, but others remained clear. Elias took them with hands that trembled slightly. "These are my mother's private papers," he said, recognizing her handwriting. "I thought they were lost in the fire that took the East Wing 3 years ago." Mary nodded. She must have moved them to the cellar for safekeeping. "Look at this one." She pointed to a letter, dated just 2 months before his mother's death. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "My dear friend." The child Mary continues to show remarkable gifts of memory and perception. Yesterday, she recited back to me a Latin phrase from Dr. Brennan's tonic bottle, word perfect, though she surely cannot understand its meaning. "Archivum sub serra cerula," she said, clear as church bells. When I asked where she heard it, she pointed to the doctor's bag and said the words were written under the blue wax seal on a bottle of nerve tonic. I begin to think the Lord has given this child abilities beyond the ordinary, perhaps for purposes beyond our current understanding. Elias read the letter twice, his heart racing. "Archivum sub serra cerula, archive beneath blue wax." "That's Latin," Mary said matter-of-factly. "The old mistress taught me some. Archive means a place where important papers are kept." Harlan had been listening with growing unease. "You ain't seriously putting stock in a child's problem?" "She's been right about everything so far," Elias interrupted. "The ribbon, the seal characteristics, the clerk's preferences. If she says there's an archive beneath blue wax, then that's where we start looking." The overseer's face darkened. "Mr. Ward, I strongly advise." "You strongly advise what?" Elias's voice carried an edge. His mother would have recognized the Ward temper, usually slow to rise but dangerous when fully awakened. "That I ignore the clearest lead we've had? That I dismiss evidence because it comes from someone you prefer to keep in chains? I advise you to remember that this estate has enemies." Harlan snapped back. "Folks who'd be happy to see it broken up and sold off to pay debts. Folks who think you're too young, too soft, too willing to upset the natural order. You keep following this child's fairy tales, you'll give them all the ammunition they need." A new voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Morning, gentlemen." They turned to see a man approaching up the muddy drive, middle-aged, well-dressed despite the rough conditions, carrying a leather satchel that marked him as either a lawyer or a doctor. Behind him walked 2 other figures, a woman in plain Quaker dress and a younger man with the calloused hands of a riverman. "Dr. Brennan," Elias said, recognizing the county's physician. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mr." He looked questioningly at the third visitor. "Caleb Marsh," the young man supplied. "Run the ferry down at Willow Crossing." "Least I did till the storm took out the bridge." Dr. Brennan set his bag on the porch railing, his sharp eyes moving from Elias to Mary to the papers in Elias's hands. "Heard you folks might need some help with legal matters, and Mrs. Whitmore here has information that might prove valuable." The Quaker woman stepped forward, her plain dress and serious manner lending weight to her words. Friend Elias, I knew thy mother well. We corresponded about matters of conscience, the peculiar institution, and its burdens on Christian souls. She confided. Certain arrangements she had made. Harlan's face had gone pale. Now see here, perhaps we should continue this conversation inside, Dr. Brennan suggested, away from curious ears. As if summoned by his words, several field hands had emerged from the quarters and were working within earshot, their attention seemingly focused on storm cleanup, but their ears obviously tuned to the porch conversation. The parlor, Elias decided. Everyone. They filed into the house, boots tracking mud across floors that had seen better days. The parlor was a monument to faded gentility, furniture worn smooth by generations of use, portraits whose subjects gazed down with painted eyes that had watched the plantation's slow decline. Mrs. Whitmore settled into a chair with the careful grace of someone accustomed to making herself heard in rooms full of men. Thy mother wrote to me 6 months before her passing. She had become convinced that slavery was a sin against God and man, but she lacked the legal means to free her bondspeople without destroying the estate that supported them. So she devised a different approach. The margin clause, Elias said. More than that. The Quaker woman reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded paper. She asked me to witness a document and keep it safe until the proper time came. I believe that time is now. She unfolded the paper with careful hands. It was a formal affidavit, written in his mother's hand and signed with her full name. I, Margaret Ward, being of sound mind and body, do hereby affirm that the attached provision for manumission is made with full knowledge and consent, and that all necessary documentation has been properly sealed and archived according to law. At the bottom, 2 signatures, Mrs. Whitmore's and Dr. Brennan's. We witnessed this 3 days before she died, the doctor said quietly. She was weak, but her mind was clear as mountain water. She made us promise not to reveal it until you came of age and took possession of the estate. Mary had been studying the paper with her usual intensity. It says, attached provision, and properly sealed and archived. That means there's more than just the Bible margin note. Indeed there is, Dr. Brennan said. He opened his medical bag and withdrew a bottle of nerve tonic, its cork sealed with blue wax. Your mother was quite specific about where certain documents should be kept. Said if anything happened to her, the child Mary would remember the Latin phrase and lead you to the truth. Elias stared at the bottle, his mind racing. Archivum sub sera Carola, archive beneath blue wax. Precisely. The doctor worked the cork free, revealing that the bottle was not filled with tonic but with tightly rolled papers. The complete manumission document, with the county clerk's official seal and signature. Your mother had it prepared in secret, filed it legally, then kept the proof where only the most observant eyes would find it. Harlan lunged forward. This is fraud, forgery. You can't expect any court to. The court will examine the documents like any other, Caleb Marsh said quietly. But they better do it quick. Word's already spreading about federal agents coming through the county, looking for irregularities in estate settlements. Any delay could bring outside oversight you don't want. Mrs. Whitmore nodded gravely. There are forces in motion, friend Elias. Forces that would see thy mother's work undone and thy conscience overruled. But there are also allies more than thou might expect. Dr. Brennan carefully extracted the papers from the bottle. The documents were in perfect condition, protected from moisture and age by their unusual hiding place. The clerk's seal was unmistakable blue wax, with the characteristic nick and imperfect swirl that Mary had identified so precisely. It's real, she breathed, studying the seal with wonder. It's exactly like what's on the board at the probate office. Real as sunrise, the doctor confirmed. Question is, what do you intend to do with it? Elias looked around the room at the Quaker woman whose conscience had allied her with his mother, at the doctor who had risked his reputation to preserve justice, at the ferryman whose loyalty had been won by simple decency, and finally at Mary, whose extraordinary gifts had led them to this moment. I intend to honor my mother's wishes, he said firmly, and I intend to prove that some promises are worth keeping, no matter the cost. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again, and in the distance, the sound of approaching horses carried on the wind like a war drum's beat. The battle for Marries' freedom was about to be joined in earnest, but for the first time since arriving at the plantation, Elias felt they had weapons equal to the fight. The horses arrived at full gallop, their hooves drumming against the muddy yard like thunder made manifest. Elias watched from the parlor window as 6 riders dismounted, 3 patrollers he recognized, 2 strangers in traveling clothes, and bringing up the rear like a bad omen, Harlan Pike's brother Jacob from the county seat. "Federal agents," Mrs. Whitmore said grimly, observing the newcomers over his shoulder. "I feared this might happen." Dr. Brennan was already packing the documents back into their hiding place. "They'll demand to examine all estate papers. If they find irregularities real or manufactured, they can freeze everything pending federal review." "How long would that take?" Elias asked. "Months, years, maybe. And in the meantime," the doctor glanced at Mary, who stood near the cold fireplace like a small, defiant ghost. "In the meantime, all property remains under current legal status." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Mary would remain enslaved, at the mercy of men who saw her gifts as threats and her freedom as dangerous precedent. A heavy knock thundered against the front door. Elias straightened his shoulders and walked to answer it, the others following close behind. On the porch stood a tall man in a dusty suit, his face bearing the kind of authority that came from federal appointment rather than local election. "Agent Morrison, United States Treasury," the man announced, producing a leather wallet with official seals. "This is Agent Crawford. We're here on reports of irregularities in the Ward estate settlement." "What kind of irregularities?" Elias asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Questions have been raised about the competency of the heir to manage valuable property, particularly human property. We've received reports of unusual arrangements being made without proper legal oversight." Jacob Pike stepped forward with the smug expression of a man holding winning cards. "My brother Harlan has been managing this estate for 3 years. He reports that the new heir has been making rash decisions, freeing slaves without legal authority, disrupting the agricultural workforce. Such actions suggest either incompetence or deliberate fraud." Agent Crawford consulted a notebook. "We also have reports of forged documents being prepared, possibly with intent to defraud creditors or evade federal slave laws." "Those are serious accusations, Doctor," Brennan said mildly. "I hope you have evidence to support them." "We'll have all the evidence we need once we examine the estate papers," Morrison replied. "Standard procedure in cases like this." Elias felt the trap closing around them like iron jaws. These men hadn't come to investigate, they'd come to seize. Someone had orchestrated this with careful precision, timing the raid for maximum effect. "Of course," he said aloud. "Though I should point out that as legal heir, I have every right to manage my property as I see fit within the bounds of law." "That remains to be determined," Morrison said. "We'll need to see all documents related to the estate, including any recent modifications to existing arrangements." From behind Elias came an unexpected sound, Mary humming. The same tune she'd been singing that first morning, the river-shaped melody that seemed to map journeys and destinations, but now it carried a different quality, urgent and purposeful. "Mrs." Whitmore's eyes sharpened as she listened. Being Quaker, she was familiar with coded hymns used by the Underground Railroad. "Child," she said softly, "is thee trying to tell us something?" Mary's humming stopped. She looked directly at Agent Morrison with those dark, penetrating eyes. "You ain't really Treasury agents," she said with startling clarity. "Your badges are wrong." The porch fell silent, except for water dripping from the eaves. "I beg your pardon." Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his coat. "Treasury badges got eagles with their wings spread wide," Mary continued in that eerily calm voice. "Yours got eagles with wings folded down. And the seal around the edge, it's supposed to say United States Treasury Department, but yours just says Treasury Department, like somebody made them without seeing a real one up close." Caleb Marsh had been examining the agents with the shrewd eyes of a man who made his living reading people. Now he stepped forward with the easy confidence of someone who had nothing to lose. "Child's right," he said. "I ferry a lot of federal men across my crossing. Never seen badges like yours." Agent Crawford's face had gone red as fresh brick. "How dare you question because I question everything," Mary said simply. "It's how I stay alive." And right now, I'm questioning why fake federal agents would show up the day after we found proof of my freedom papers. The words hit like lightning striking a powder keg. Jacob Pike cursed and went for the gun at his belt. But Dr. Brennan was faster, producing a horse pistol from his medical bag with the smooth motion of a man long accustomed to frontier dangers. "I wouldn't," the doctor said conversationally. "Hippocratic oath says, first, do no harm, but it don't say nothing about last resort." Morrison raised his hands slowly. "Now, see here, there's no need for violence. We're just you're trying to steal a child's freedom with fake badges and manufactured authority," Mrs. Whitmore said, her Quaker calm giving way to righteous anger. "The shame of it falls on your heads and the heads of those who sent you." The patrollers were looking increasingly uncomfortable, caught between their loyalty to the Pike brothers and the growing realization that they'd been dragged into something darker than simple slave catching. "Mr. Ward," said one of them, a man named Tucker whom Elias remembered from town, "we was told this was federal business, proper and legal." "If it ain't, it ain't," Caleb said firmly. "Question is, what you gonna do about it?" The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. 6 armed men faced off on a muddy porch, while a slip of a girl stood at the center of it all, her freedom hanging in the balance like a sword over all their heads. Then, from somewhere beyond the plantation boundaries, came the sound of more horses approaching, but these riders sang as they came, their voices carrying the unmistakable cadence of a hymn. "Missus." Whitmore smiled grimly. "Friends," she said, "I sent word this morning to several like-minded families. It seems they've arrived just in time." The new riders crested the hill in a line 12, Quaker farmers and their sons, armed with nothing more threatening than Bibles and an unshakable conviction that some things were worth fighting for without violence. Morrison looked at the approaching reinforcements, then at Dr. Brennan's steady pistol, then at Marries' unwavering gaze. When he spoke, his voice had lost its official bluster. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Elias agreed, "but it's going to be finished legal and proper, in a courtroom with real judges and authentic documents. Not with fake badges and manufactured authority." The false agents withdrew with as much dignity as they could muster, taking the uncomfortable patrollers with them. Only Jacob Pike lingered on the porch steps, his face twisted with frustrated rage. "You think you're clever," he snarled at Miri, "but chains or no chains, you're still property, and property can be lost, sold, or destroyed if the owner ain't careful." Before anyone could respond, Miri stepped forward. For all her small stature, she suddenly seemed to fill the porch with presence that made grown men step back. "Mr. Pike," she said in a voice clear as spring water, "you keep talking about property and ownership like they're laws of nature. But I got news for you. The only thing I own for certain is my memory, and my memory says you and your brother been stealing from this estate for years. Question is, do you want to settle this quiet-like, or do you want me to start remembering out loud in front of judges and juries?" The threat was delivered with such calm certainty that Jacob Pike actually stumbled backward. He opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. With a final curse, he mounted his horse and rode after the retreating false agents. Dr. Brennan lowered his pistol. "Well," he said mildly, "that was educational." Mary turned to look at the approaching Quaker farmers, who had begun unhitching their horses and making camp in the yard with the practiced efficiency of people who knew they might be staying a while. "Storms passed," she said, but her eyes remained fixed on the horizon where storm clouds still gathered. "But I got a feeling the real weather's still coming." She was right, of course. She usually was. The courthouse square buzzed with tension thick as honey on a cold morning. Word of the confrontation at the Ward plantation had spread through the county like wildfire, growing in the telling until some claimed federal agents had been driven off at gunpoint, while others swore the whole business was a clever fraud designed to steal a fortune in human property. Elias stood on the courthouse steps, the morning sun warm on his shoulders, but ice in his veins. Beside him, Miri held the family Bible with steady hands, the blue ribbon marking their place in a story that was finally nearing its end. Behind them, a cluster of witnesses had gathered Dr. Brennan with his medical bag, Mrs. Whitmore in her plain Quaker dress, Caleb Marsh still muddy from his morning ferry run, and a handful of farmers whose presence spoke louder than any words about where their sympathies lay. "Judge'll be here directly," called the court clerk from the doorway. Same nervous apprentice from the probate office, now promoted to handling the county's weightiest business. "Says he wants this matter settled today, one way or another." Harlan Pike emerged from the crowd like a wolf from tall grass, his brother Jacob at his side and a coterie of town toughs bringing up the rear. The false federal agents were nowhere to be seen, but their work had been done, doubt had been sown, questions raised, the legitimacy of the Ward estate thrown into dispute. "Still time to reconsider," Harlan called across the square. "Child's a valuable piece of property. Sell her south and settle your debts clean. No need for all this legal foolishness." "Only foolishness here is yours," replied a new voice. "Judge Nathaniel Brennan, Doctor." Brennan's younger brother climbed the courthouse steps with the measured pace of a man who had seen enough of life to surprise at little and forgive even less. Tall and angular, with iron-grey hair and eyes like winter sky, he carried the authority of 2 decades on the bench. "Your Honor," Elias said, removing his hat. "Mr. Ward, I understand you have documents to present regarding the manumission of a certain enslaved person." "I do, Your Honor, along with witnesses to their authenticity." Judge Brennan's gaze moved to Mary, studying her with the careful attention he might give to any other piece of evidence. "And this is the individual in question? Mary, Your Honor, held in bondage on the Ward plantation these past 10 years. 10 years is a long time for someone so young." The judge's voice carried a note of something, not quite sympathy, but perhaps understanding. "What makes you believe you have grounds for manumission?" Dr. Brennan stepped forward. "Your Honor, with your permission?" At his brother's nod, the doctor opened his medical bag and withdrew the blue wax bottle that had concealed the crucial documents. These papers were prepared in secret by the deceased Margaret Ward and filed with the county clerk 6 months before her death. They were witnessed and preserved according to her specific instructions. Judge Brennan accepted the papers and examined them with the thoroughness of a man accustomed to spotting forgeries. The crowd pressed closer, sensing the moment's import. Even the morning birds seemed to hush as the judge read. "The manumission clause is properly constructed," he said finally. "The seal appears authentic, but I notice a condition here upon marriage of the heir to a woman of any station or upon the swearing of a solemn oath before witnesses. Has this condition been met?" Elias felt his heart hammer against his ribs. They had the legal foundation, but the structure wasn't complete without fulfilling the specified terms. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying across the square, "I am prepared to swear such an oath today, before these witnesses and this court." Harlan Pike shouldered through the crowd. "This is a mockery. The boy's been bewitched by a slave child's tricks. She's got him believing her memories and fantasies, leading him around by the nose like a prize bull. The child's memories seem quite accurate so far," Judge Brennan observed mildly. "In fact, her identification of seal characteristics led to the discovery of certain irregularities in your financial management of the estate." Jacob Pike's face went white as old bone. "What irregularities?" Mrs. Whitmore reached into her reticule and withdrew a ledger bound in cracked leather. This was found among Margaret Ward's hidden papers. It details a rather creative accounting system employed by the estate's overseers. She opened the ledger to pages, marked with red ink, double charges for supplies never delivered, wages paid to workers who never existed, sale of crops at prices well below market rate to buyers who seemed to share certain family names. The crowd stirred like wheat in wind. "Doctor." Brennan took the ledger and handed it to his brother, who examined it with growing interest. "These appear to be in your handwriting, Mr. Pike," the judge said to Harlan. "Would you care to explain the mathematical discrepancies?" That's completely fabricated," Harlan sputtered. "The child probably forged it herself. Everyone knows she's got an unnatural memory for details. Could have copied my hand easy enough." Mary stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the courthouse stones. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Judge Brennan considered this unusual request. "The court will hear from any witness with relevant testimony." "Thank you, sir." Mary's voice carried clearly across the square, pitched with the same perfect accuracy she brought to her hymns. "Mr. Pike says I might have forged that ledger, but here's what he don't know. I can't write." A murmur ran through the crowd. Harlan's face flushed red. "Can't write," Mary continued, "but I can remember. Every conversation, every transaction, every lie told in my hearing these past 4 years. Would the court like me to recite them? That won't be necessary, Judge Brennan said quickly, though your memory might be useful for other purposes. Can you recall the exact wording of your late mistress's manumission clause? Mary closed her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice took on the cadence of formal legal language. Upon the marriage of any ward heir to a woman of any station, or upon the swearing of a solemn oath before witnesses, the bonded servant, known as Mary, shall be granted full manumission, with all rights and privileges thereunto, this clause to be sealed and witnessed by proper authority. She opened her eyes, word for word, just like it's written in the margin. Judge Brennan compared her recitation to the document in his hands. Perfect accuracy. Most impressive. He looked up at Elias. Are you prepared to fulfill the oath requirement, Mr. Ward? I am, Your Honor. Then, speak your oath, for the record. Elias removed his hat and placed his right hand on the family Bible. The square fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the courthouse oak and the distant sound of the river running toward the sea. I, Elias Ward, heir to the Ward plantation and its properties, do solemnly swear, before God, and these witnesses that I will honor my mother's covenant and grant full freedom to the person known as Mary. I further swear that she will be treated with the dignity and respect due any free citizen, with rights to education, wages for her labor, and protection under law. I swear this by my word as a gentleman and my faith as a Christian, and may God judge me if I prove false to this oath. His words seemed to hang in the morning air like visible things, weighty with promise and possibility. Judge Brennan nodded slowly. The oath is properly sworn and witnessed. By the authority vested in this court, I hereby declare the manumission clause valid and binding. The individual known as Mary is granted full freedom, with all rights and privileges of a free person under the laws of this state and nation. The gavel fell with the finality of thunder. For a moment, the square held its breath. Then cheers erupted from the Quaker farmers and their allies, while curses and grumbles rose from those who had hoped for a different outcome. Harlan Pike stood slack-jawed, his face cycling through expressions of rage, disbelief, and dawning fear as he realized his own legal troubles were just beginning. Doctor, Brennan clapped his brother on the shoulder. Solomon himself couldn't have handled it better. Mrs. Whitmore wrapped Mary in a fierce hug. Free, child. Free as the wind, and twice as strong. But Mary's attention was fixed on Elias, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. Thank you, he replied, for showing me what courage looks like in a small package. As the crowd began to disperse, Judge Brennan approached them with a final piece of business. Mr. Ward, there's still the matter of the estate's debts and the irregularities in its management. I suspect the recovery of stolen funds will go a long way toward resolving your financial difficulties. And the Pikes will face charges for fraud and embezzlement. Justice delayed is not justice denied. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing a world that looked the same but felt fundamentally different. Chains had been broken not just with iron tools, but with words and witnesses, with memory and courage, and the simple recognition that some truths were too powerful to keep buried. On the courthouse steps, a young man and a newly freed child stood side by side, facing a future neither could fully see, but both were ready to meet with hope. The little chapel sat at the crossroads like a covenant made visible, its white clapboard walls bright against the green sweep of summer fields. Evening light slanted through windows that held no stained glass, but caught the sunset like amber, painting the simple interior in shades of gold and promise. Reverend. Silas stood behind the plain wooden pulpit, his weathered hands gentle on the pages of a Bible worn soft by use. To his right sat Mary on a wooden chair too large for her small frame, her feet not quite touching the floor, the blue ribbon from the family Bible now tied in her hair like a badge of honor. To his left, Elias stood with his hat in his hands and wonder in his eyes. Friends, Reverend, Silas said, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent shepherding souls through life's storms. We gather in this sacred place to witness the birth of something new, not just the freedom of one child, but the formation of a family bound not by law or custom, but by choice and covenant. The pews held faces that had become familiar over the past week. Mrs. Whitmore in her plain Quaker dress, Dr. Brennan with his medical bag resting at his feet, Caleb Marsh still bearing the honest dirt of his ferry work, the farmers who had come when needed and stayed to see justice done. Even Jonah was there, the old stable hand who had warned them of time running out, but lived to see it stretch into possibility. "The law has spoken, Reverend," Silas continued, "and chains have been struck from ankles that should never have worn them. But freedom is more than the absence of bondage. It is the presence of hope, the promise of dignity, the chance to choose one's path and walk it with head held high." Through the open windows came the sound of evening settling over the countryside, the lowing of cattle heading home, the splash of fish jumping in the creek, the rustle of wind through corn that had survived the storm and grown stronger for the testing. "Mary, Reverend," Silas said, turning to the child with gentle eyes, "you have been given the gift of memory, perfect and true. What will you do with such a gift?" She considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. "I'll remember the hymns that led us through dark places, and I'll teach them to others who need finding their way. I'll remember the kindness shown to me, and I'll pass it on to whoever needs it most. And I'll remember that freedom ain't just about breaking chains, it's about helping others break theirs. And you, Elias," the preacher said, "you have been given the responsibility of stewardship, not just of land and property, but of lives and futures. How will you discharge this trust? By treating every person on this plantation as exactly that, a person, with dignity and rights that come from God, not from masters. By paying fair wages for honest work, by providing education for those who want it, by creating a place where chains need never be forged again because they'll never be needed." "Reverend?" Silas nodded approvingly. "Then let us make this covenant official. Mary, do you freely choose to remain here as part of the Ward household, not as property but as family?" "I do choose it, freely and gladly." "Elias, do you freely accept the responsibility of guardianship, to provide for Mary's welfare, education, and protection as you would for your own sister?" "I do accept it, before God and these witnesses. Then by the authority granted to me by God and the Church, I pronounce you bound by covenant, as family in all but blood, with all the rights and responsibilities such a bond entails." "Reverend." Silas reached for the family Bible, still open to the psalm where the blue ribbon had marked their place for so long. Mary untied the ribbon from her hair and laid it across the page, while Elias placed his mother's signet ring beside it. Two symbols of faith and family joined in a new configuration. "Let us pray," Reverend Silas said, and heads bowed throughout the chapel. "Lord, you have seen fit to break the chains that bound this child and to open the heart of this young man. Bless now the family they have chosen to become. Give them wisdom in the days ahead, courage in times of trial, and joy in the simple gift of freedom shared. May their covenant be a light to others who struggle in darkness, and may their household be a place where your love is made manifest in word and deed." "Amen, amen," echoed the congregation, and the words seemed to linger in the evening air like incense. As they filed out of the chapel, Mary tugged at Elias's sleeve. "What happens now?" He looked down at her, this extraordinary child who had led him through a maze of legal troubles and moral choices, whose perfect memory had uncovered truth and whose courage had made freedom possible. "Now we go home," he said, "and we build something worth the trouble it took to get here." They walked together down the dusty road, the newly formed family and their friends, while fireflies began their nightly dance in the fields, and the first stars appeared in a sky the color of deep water. Behind them, the chapel stood quiet and satisfied, having witnessed another small miracle in a world that sometimes seemed short on such things. At the plantation house, lanterns had been lit on the porch, and the field hands had gathered in the yard. Some looked uncertain, perhaps wondering how this change would affect their own lives. Others seemed hopeful, as if freedom might be contagious and the breaking of one set of chains might herald the loosening of others. Elias climbed the porch steps and turned to face them all, black and white, bond and free, neighbors and strangers who had become family through the crucible of shared struggle. "Friends," he said, his voice carrying across the yard to every listening ear, "we've learned something important these past weeks. We've learned that the strongest chains are often the ones we can't see, the chains of custom and habit, of fear and indifference, of believing that wrong things are right just because they've always been done that way. He paused, letting his words sink in like rain on thirsty ground. But we've also learned that such chains can be broken, not with hammers and files, but with courage and conscience, with memory and truth, with the simple recognition that every person, every single person, carries within them a spark of the divine that no law or custom can extinguish. Mary stepped up beside him, her small hand finding his large one. "And we've learned," she said in that clear, carrying voice, "that freedom ain't something you get, it's something you give. The more you share it, the stronger it gets." Somewhere in the gathering dusk, a voice began to sing not a coded hymn full of hidden meanings, but a simple song of praise and thanksgiving. Other voices joined in, weaving together in harmony that spoke of hope made audible, of chains transformed into music, of promises kept and futures claimed. As the last notes faded into the night, Elias and Mary walked onto the porch where lamplight spilled like golden honey across the boards their feet had learned to call home. 3 months after the courthouse reckoning, the Ward plantation hummed with changes both subtle and profound. The cotton still needed picking, and the corn still required tending, but the work was done by hands that earned wages, and the workers slept in quarters they could leave at will. The transformation hadn't been without difficulties. Some of the neighboring planters viewed Elias's reforms with suspicion that bordered on hostility, and more than once he'd been warned about the dangers of setting precedents. But the warnings had been accompanied by grudging respect as well. The plantation's productivity had actually increased once the workers had something to work for beyond the avoidance of punishment. Dr. Brennan, making his rounds through the county, reported that other estates were quietly implementing similar reforms, though few were willing to admit where the inspiration had come from. On this particular evening in late September, Elias sat on the front porch with account books spread across a small table, lamplight dancing across columns of figures that finally showed more black than red. The recovery of funds stolen by the Pike brothers had gone far towards stabilizing the estate's finances, and the increased productivity had done the rest. For the first time since inheriting the plantation, he could see a future that didn't involve selling off pieces of his birthright to satisfy creditors. Mary emerged from the house carrying a tray with 2 cups of coffee and a plate of corn cakes still warm from the oven. She'd grown in the months since her freedom, not just in height and weight as proper food and rest took effect, but in confidence and purpose. The fearful, chained child had become a thoughtful young woman who moved through the world with quiet authority. "Mrs. Patterson stopped by while you were in the fields," she said, settling into the chair beside his. "Wants to know if I'd be willing to teach her youngest daughter piano. Says she heard me practicing on your mother's old instrument and was impressed by my, what did she call it? Natural musical gifts." Elias looked up from his ledgers, smiling. "And what did you tell her?" "That I'd be happy to, for fair wages and with the understanding that music lessons come with other kinds of learning, reading, writing, arithmetic. Knowledge is like freedom, the more you share it, the stronger it gets." It had become one of her favorite sayings, that last part. Elias suspected she'd heard it from Mrs. Whitmore during one of their weekly Quaker meetings, where Mary was learning about the broader movement for social reform that extended far beyond the borders of their small Mississippi county. She agreed, eagerly. "Seems the Patterson girl has been asking for proper schooling, and Mrs. Patterson's husband figures music lessons are respectable enough to satisfy the neighbors while giving his daughter what she really needs." A firefly blinked on and off near the porch railing, its tiny light bright against the gathering darkness. Others joined it, until the yard flickered with points of illumination like earthbound stars. "Reverend, Silas wants to know if you'll speak at the Harvest Festival," Mary continued, "about the changes you've made here, how other planters might consider similar reforms without losing their minds or their profits." Elias considered this. Public speaking had never been his strength, but he'd found that the story of their struggles and successes seemed to resonate with people who were ready to hear it. "What do you think?" "I think," Mary said carefully, "that stories have power. The right story, told at the right time, can change hearts faster than all the laws and lectures in the world. And our story, well, it's one worth telling." From the direction of the quarters came the sound of singing, not the coded hymns of desperate times, but the open harmonies of people who had found reasons to hope. The voices wove together in melodies that spoke of gratitude and possibility, of small miracles acknowledged and larger ones still to come. "There's something else," Mary said, her tone growing more serious. "Got a letter today from a lawyer up in Illinois. Says there's a family there, free-colored folk who've been looking for their daughter, girl who was sold south about 10 years ago when she was just a baby." Elias's hand stilled on his coffee cup. "And? Description matches what I remember of myself before the chains. Dark hair with a curl to it, birthmark on my left shoulder shaped like a crescent moon, and..." She pulled at the neckline of her dress, revealing a small scar just below her collarbone. "This mark from where I fell on a broken bottle when I was learning to walk." The implications settled over Elias like evening mist. If Mary had family searching for her, free family with legal standing to claim her. "What do you want to do?" Mary was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the fireflies dancing in the darkness. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "I want to write to them, want to learn about who I was before this place, before the chains, but I also want them to know who I've become since. This is my home now. These are my people, and the work we're doing here. It matters. Maybe they'll understand that. Maybe they'll want to be part of it. And if they want you to come north with them..." She smiled, and in that expression, Elias saw the full measure of her transformation from frightened child to confident young woman. "Then we'll figure it out together, all of us. Because that's what families do, they work things out." A new sound joined the evening symphony, the clip-clop of horses approaching up the main drive. Elias stood, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol he'd taken to wearing since the troubles with the Pike brothers. But the riders came openly, their lantern light announcing peaceful intentions. 3 horses emerged from the darkness, carrying familiar figures: Dr. Brennan, Mrs. Whitmore, and behind them, a young woman Elias didn't recognize, well-dressed but travel-worn, with Mary's dark hair and the same sharp intelligence in her eyes. Mary was already on her feet, something in her expression suggesting she'd recognized the stranger before Elias did. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my sister." The woman dismounted with fluid grace and approached the porch steps, her eyes never leaving Mary's face. When she spoke, her voice carried the precise diction of education and refinement, but underneath it was an emotion so raw it made Elias's throat tight. "Miriam? Is it really you?" Miriam stepped forward into the lamplight, her own voice thick with tears she was too proud to shed. "Sarah? Sarah, is that really you?" The sisters flew into each other's arms with a collision that spoke of years of grief and searching, of hope deferred but never abandoned. Elias stepped back, giving them space for their reunion, while Dr. Brennan and Mrs. Whitmore dismounted and joined him on the porch. "Family, it seems, has a way of finding itself," Dr. Brennan observed quietly. Mrs. Whitmore nodded. "The letter they mentioned reached them faster than expected. They've been traveling for 2 weeks to get here." "She's free," Elias said, needing to make that clear from the start. "Legally, officially free, whatever claims they might have." "They're not here to claim her," the Quaker woman assured him. "They're here to claim their place in her new life, if she'll have them." The sisters had stepped apart, but kept their hands joined, as if afraid that letting go might make the miracle disappear. Sarah looked up at Elias with eyes that held both gratitude and assessment. "You're Elias Ward," she said. "The man who gave my sister her freedom." "Your sister earned her own freedom," Elias replied. "I just helped remove some obstacles." Sarah smiled, and he saw where Mary had learned her gift for reading people. "Modesty becomes you, Mr. Ward. But from what Dr. Brennan tells me, you did considerably more than remove obstacles. You've created something here, a model for how things might be different." "We all created it," Mary said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "And there's room for more hands if you're interested in the work." "What kind of work?" Mary gestured toward the lights glowing in the quarters, where freed slaves were building new lives with the tools of literacy and hope. "The work of proving that freedom isn't just about breaking chains, it's about building something better in their place. Schools, businesses, communities where people are valued for what they contribute instead of what they cost." Sarah looked around the plantation with the eyes of someone who understood both the history of such places and their potential for transformation. It sounds like the work of a lifetime. Maybe several lifetimes, Elias agreed. But we've made a start. As if summoned by their words, figures began emerging from the quarters, men and women who had heard the commotion and come to investigate. They approached the porch with the careful dignity of people who had learned to judge character quickly and accurately. Among them, Elias recognized several of his most trusted workers, people who had become friends as well as employees. "Folks," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard, "I'd like you to meet Sarah Freeman Marries' sister, traveling here from Illinois." The introductions that followed were warm but measured, as the community that had formed around the plantation took the measure of this newcomer. Sarah handled it with the poise of someone accustomed to navigating between worlds, asking thoughtful questions and offering genuine interest in the stories she heard. As the evening deepened and more neighbors arrived, drawn by the network of informal communication that spread news faster than any telegraph, the porch gathering became an impromptu celebration. Someone produced a fiddle, another contributed a harmonica, and soon music filled the air with melodies that spoke of joy found in unexpected places. Miri, now Miriam again, though she seemed comfortable with both names, stood between her sister and Elias, her face glowing with a happiness that transformed the entire gathering. This was what freedom looked like, Elias realized, not just the absence of chains, but the presence of choice, community, possibility. "Mr. Ward," Sarah said during a lull in the music, "Miriam tells me you're planning to speak at the Harvest Festival about the changes you've made here. I'm considering it. I hope you'll decide in favor. There are people all over this country, north and south, who need to hear that there's another way forward. That the choice isn't between slavery and economic collapse, but between old systems and better ones." Dr. Brennan raised his coffee cup in a toast. "To better systems, then, and to the courage to build them. To family found and freedom shared," Mrs. Whitmore added. "To the future," Elias said, "and the children who'll inherit what we choose to build today." The toasts continued around the two-circle as more cups were raised and more voices joined in. But it was Miriam who offered the final words, her clear voice carrying across the gathering with the authority of someone who had traveled from bondage to freedom and understood the journey's true meaning. "To the light that breaks chains," she said, "and the love that keeps them broken." The music began again, weaving through the night air like visible proof that some promises, once made, create their own momentum toward fulfillment. On the porch of a plantation house that had sheltered both sorrow and joy, a family born of choice rather than blood, bonded by courage rather than custom, celebrated the simple miracle of being able to choose their own tomorrow. And in the distance, fireflies danced like earthbound stars, each tiny light a reminder that even the smallest illumination can push back enormous darkness when it finds the courage to shine.